Chapter 5 of Sylvia's Lovers by Elizabeth Gaskell. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Read by Terence Callan. Chapter 5 Story of the Press Gang. For a few days after the evening mentioned in the last chapter, the weather was dull. Not in quick, sudden showers did the rain come down, but in constant drizzle, blotting out all color from the surrounding landscape and filling the air with fine gray mist until people breathed more water than air. At such times the consciousness of the nearness of the vast unseen sea acted as a dreary depression to the spirits, but besides acting on the nerves of the excitable, such weather affected the sensitive or ailing in material ways. Daniel Robson's fit of rheumatism incapacitated him from stirring abroad, and to a man of his active habits and somewhat inactive mind, this was a great hardship. He was not ill-tempered naturally, but this state of confinement made him more ill-tempered than he had ever been before in his life. He sat in the chimney corner, abusing the weather and doubting the wisdom or desirableness of all his wife saw fit to do in the usual daily household matters. The chimney corner was really a corner at Haytersbank. There were two projecting walls on each side of the fireplace, running about 6 feet into the room, and a stout wooden settle was placed against one of these, while opposite was the circular-backed master's chair, the seat of which was composed of a square piece of wood judiciously hollowed out and placed with one corner to the front. Here, in full view of all the operations going on over the fire, sat Daniel Robson for 4 livelong days, advising and directing his wife in all such minor matters as the boiling of potatoes, the making of porridge, all the work on which she specially piqued herself, and on which she would have taken advice, no, not from the most skilled housewife in all the 3 writings. But somehow she managed to keep her tongue quiet from telling him, as she would have done any woman and any other man, to mind his own business, or she would pin a dishclout to his tail. She even checked Sylvia when the latter proposed, as much for fun as for anything else, that his ignorant directions should be followed, and the consequences brought before his eyes and his nose. "Na, said Bell, they feyther's feyther, and we mun respect him, but it's dree work having a man in the house, nursing the fire, and such weather too, and not a soul coming near us, not even to fall out wi' him. For thee and me must na do that, for the Bible's sake, dear. And a good stand-up wordy quarrel would do him a power of good, stir his blood like. I wish Philip would turn up." Belle sighed, for in these 4 days she had experienced somewhat of Madame de Maintenon's difficulty, and with fewer resources to meet it, of trying to amuse a man who was not amusable. For Belle, good and sensible as she was not a woman of resources. Sylvia's plan, undutiful as it was in her mother's eyes, would have done Daniel more good, even though it might have made him angry, than his wife's quiet, careful monotony of action, which, however it might conduce to her husband's comfort when he was absent, did not amuse him when present. Sylvia scouted the notion of Cousin Philip coming into their household in the character of an amusing or entertaining person, till she nearly made her mother angry at her ridicule of the good, steady young fellow, to whom Belle looked up as the pattern of all that early manhood should be. But the moment Sylvia saw she had been giving her mother pain, she left off her wilful little jokes and kissed her and told her she would manage all famously, and ran out of the back kitchen, in which mother and daughter had been scrubbing the churn and all the wooden implements of butter-making. Belle looked at the pretty figure of her little daughter, as running past with her apron thrown over her head, she darkened the window beneath which her mother was doing her work. She paused just for a moment, and then said, almost unawares to herself, "Bless thee, lass," before resuming her scouring of what already looked almost snow-white. Sylvia scampered across the rough farmyard in the wetting, drizzling rain to the place where she expected to find Kester, but he was not there, so she had to retrace her steps to the cow-house, and making her way up a rough kind of ladder staircase fixed straight against the wall, she surprised Kester as he sat in the wool loft, looking over the fleeces reserved for the home spinning, by popping her bright face, swathed round with her blue woolen apron, up through the trap door, and thus, her head the only visible part, she addressed the farm servant, who was almost like one of the family. "Kester, feyther's just tiring hissel with weariness and vexation, sitting by to fireside wi' his hands afore him, and naught to do. And mother and me can't think on aught as'll rouse him up to a bit of a laugh, or aught more cheerful than a scolding. Now, Kester, thou mun just be off and find Harry Donkin the tailor, and bring him here. It's getting on for Martinmas, and he'll be coming his rounds, and he may as well come here first as last. And feyther's clothes want a deal o' mending up, and Harry's always full of his news, and anyhow he'll do for feyther to scold, and be a new person too, and that's somewhat for all on us. Now go like a good old Kester as you are." Kester looked at her with loving, faithful admiration. He had set himself his day's work in his master's absence, and was very desirous of finishing it, but somehow he never dreamed of resisting Sylvia, so he only stated the case. "Tool's a vast o' muck in it, and a thought as I'd feddle it and do it up, but I reckon I mun do your biddin'." "There's a good old Kester," said she, smiling and nodding her muffled head at him. Then she dipped down out of his sight, then rose up again. He had never taken his slow, moony eyes from the spot where she had disappeared, to say, "Now, Kester, be wary and deep. Thou mun tell Harry Donkin not to let on as we've sent for him, but just to come in as if he were on his round, and took us first, and he must ask feyther if there is any work for him to do, and I'll answer for it he'll have a welcome and a half. Now be deep and fause, mind thee." "As deep and fause enow with simple folk, but what can I do in Donkin be as fause as me, as happen he may be? Ga way wi' ye, Donkin be Solomon, thou mun be Queen of Sheba." And I's bound for to say she outwitted him at last. Kester laughed so long at the idea of his being the Queen of Sheba that Sylvia was back by her mother's side before the cachinnation ended. That night, just as Sylvia was preparing to go to bed in her little closet of a room, she heard some shot rattling at her window. She opened the little casement and saw Kester standing below. He recommenced where he left off with a laugh. "He, he, he! I's been to Queen. I's taken Duncan on to reet side, and he'll coom in tomorrow, just permiscus, and ax for work, like as if 'twere a favour, and told Felly were a bit cross-grained at startin', for he were workin' at Farmer Crosskey's up at t'other side o' town, where they puts a strike and a half of mout intil to beer, when most folk put nobbut a strike, and to made him ill to convince, but he'll coom, never fear." The honest fellow never said a word of the shilling he had paid out of his own pocket to forward Sylvia's wishes, and to persuade the tailor to leave the good beer. All his anxiety now was to know if he had been missed, and if it was likely that a scolding awaited him in the morning. "Told meester didn't set up his back, 'cause I didn't come in to supper." "He questioned a bit as to what thou were about, but mother didn't know, and I held my peace. Mother carried thy supper into loft for thee." "I'll gang after it then, for I'm like a pair of bellowses wi' t' wind out, just two flat sides wi' nowt betwixt." The next morning Sylvia's face was a little redder than usual, when Harry Donkin's bow legs were seen circling down the path to the house door. "Here's Donkin for sure," exclaimed Belle, when she caught sight of him a minute after her daughter. "Well, I just call that lucky, for he'll be company for thee while Sylvia and me has to turn the cheeses." This was too original a remark for a wife to make in Daniel's opinion, on this especial morning when his rheumatism was twinging him more than usual, so he replied with severity, "That's all t'women know about it. With them it's company, 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 and they think a man's no better than theirselves. I'd have you know, I've a vast o' thoughts in myself, and I'm no unwilling to lay out for the benefit of every man. I've niver gotten time for meditation sin' I were married, leastways since I left to sea. Aboard ship wi' niver a woman within leagues o' hail, and up to masthead in special I could." "Then I'd better tell Donkin as we've no work for him," said Sylvia, instinctively managing her father by agreeing with him, instead of reasoning with or contradicting him. "Now there you go," wrenching himself round, for fear Sylvia should carry her meekly made threat into execution. Ugh, as his limb hurt him. "Come in, Harry, come in and talk a bit of sense to me, for I've been shut up wi' women these 4 days, and I'm almost natteral by this time. I's bound for they'll find you some work, if it's not but for to save their own fingers." So Harry took off his coat and seated himself professional-wise on the hastily cleared dresser, so that he might have all the light afforded by the long, low casement window. Then he blew in his thimble, sucked his fingers so that they might adhere tightly together, and looked about for a subject for opening conversation, while Sylvia and her mother might be heard opening and shutting drawers and box lids before they could find the articles that needed repair, or that were required to mend each other. "Women's well enough in their way," said Daniel in a philosophizing tone, "but a man may have too much on 'em. Now there's me leg fast these 4 days, and I'll make free to say to you, I'd rather a deal have been loading dung into wettest weather, and I reckon it's the being with naught but women as tires me so. They talk so foolish it gets into bones like. Now thou knowest thou'rt not called much of a man or other, but bless you, to the 9th part summat to be thankful for, after naught but women, and yet you seen they were for sending you away in their foolishness. Well, missus, and who's to pay for the fettling of all them clothes?" As Belle came down with her arms full, she was going to answer her husband meekly and literally according to her wont, but Sylvia, already detecting the increased cheerfulness of his tone, called out from behind her mother, "I am, feyther. I'm going for to sell my new cloak as I bought Thursday, for the mending on your old coats and waistcoats." "Hearken till her," said Daniel, chuckling. "She's a true wench. 3 days sin, no one so full as she o' t' new cloak that now she's fain to sell. Ay, Harry, if feyther won't pay you for making all these old clothes as good as new, I'll sell my new red cloak sooner than you shall go unpaid." "I reckon it's a bargain," said Harry, casting sharp professional eyes on the heap before him, and singling out the best article as to texture for examination and comment. "They're all again these metal buttons," said he. "Silk weavers has been petitioning ministers to make a law to favour silk buttons, and I did hear tell as there were informers going about spying after metal buttons, and as how they could haul you before a justice for wearing on 'em. I were wed in 'em, and I'll wear 'em to my dying day, or I'll wear noan at all. They're for making such a pack of laws they'll be for meddling with my fashion of sleeping next, and taxing me for every snore I give. They've been after to winders, and after to victual, and after to very sout to it. It's dearer by half, and no more it were than I were a boy. They're a meddlesome set of folks, lawmakers is, and I'll niver believe King George has aught to do with it. But mark my words, I were wed with brass buttons, and brass buttons I'll wear to my death, and if they moither me about it, I'll wear brass buttons in my coffin." By this time Harry had arranged a certain course of action with Mrs. Robson, conducting the consultation and agreement by signs. His thread was flying fast already, and the mother and daughter felt more free to pursue their own business than they had done for several days, for it was a good sign that Daniel had taken his pipe out of the square hollow in the fireside wall where he usually kept it, and was preparing to diversify his remarks with satisfying interludes of puffing. "Why, look ye, this very baccy had a run for it. It came ashore sewed up neatly enough in a woman's stays, as was wife to a fishing smack down to bay yonder. She were a lean thing as ever you saw, when she went for to see her husband aboard to vessel, but she coom back lustier by a deal, and with many a thing on her, here and there besides baccy, and that were into face a coast guard on yon tender and all. But she made as though she were tipsy, and so they did naught but curse her and get out on her way. Speaking of tender, there's been a piece of work in Monkshaven this week with the press gang," said Harry. Aye, our lass was telling about. But Lord bless ye, there's no getting to rights on a story out on a woman, though I will say this for our Sylvie, she's as bright a lass as ever a man looked at." Now the truth was that Daniel had not liked to demean himself at the time when Sylvia came back so full of what she had seen at Monkshaven, by evincing any curiosity on the subject. He had then thought that the next day he would find some business that should take him down to the town, when he could learn all that was to be learnt, without flattering his womankind by asking questions, as if anything they might say could interest him. He had a strong notion of being a kind of domestic Jupiter. "It's made a deal of work in Monkshaven. Folk had gotten to think naught o' the tender. She lay so still, and the lieutenant paid such a good price for all he wanted for to ship. But a Thursday to Resolution, first whaler back this season, came in port, and the press gang showed their teeth, and carried off 4 as good able-bodied seamen as ever I made trousers for, and the place were all up like a nest of wasps when you've set your foot into midst. They were so mad they were ready for to fight to very paving stones. I wish I'd been there. I just wish I had. I've a score for to reckon up with the press gang." And the old man lifted up his right hand, his hand on which the forefinger and thumb were maimed and useless, partly in denunciation and partly as a witness of what he had endured to escape from the service, abhorred because it was forced. His face became a totally different countenance with the expression of settled and unrelenting indignation, which his words called out. "Gone, man, gone," said Daniel, impatient with Donkin for the little delay, occasioned by the necessity of arranging his work more fully. Aye, all in good time, for I've a long tale to tell yet, and a mun have someone to iron me out my seams and look me out my bits, for there's none here fit for my purpose. Dang thy bits! Here, Sylvie, come and be tailor's man, and let the chap get settled sharp, for I'm faint to hear his story." Sylvia took her directions and placed her irons in the fire and ran upstairs for the bundle which had been put aside by her careful mother for occasions like the present. It consisted of small pieces of various colored cloth, cut out of old coats and waistcoats, and similar garments, when the whole had become too much worn for use, yet when part had been good enough to be treasured by a thrifty housewife. Daniel grew angry before Donkin had selected his patterns and settled the work to his own mind. "Well," said he at last, "I mout be a young man a-goin' a-wooing by to pains thou's taken for to match my old clothes. I don't care if they're patched with scarlet, I tell thee. So as thou'lt work away at thy tale with thy tongue, same time as thou works at thy needle with thy fingers." Then, as I were saying, all Monkshaven were like a nest of wasps, flying hither and thither, and making such a buzzing and a talking as never were, and each wi' his sting out, ready for to vent his venom o' rage and revenge, and women crying and sobbing into streets, when, Lord help us, a Saturday came a worse time than ever, for all Friday there'd been a kind of expectation and dismay about to good fortune, as to mariners had said was off St. Ab's Head o' Thursday, when to Resolution came in, and there was wives and maids with husbands and sweethearts aboard to good fortune, ready to throw their eyes out on their heads with gazing norwards or to sea, as were all one haze of blankness with to rain. And when to afternoon tide comed in, and niver a line on her to be seen, folk were uncertain as to whether she were holding off for fear to tender, as we're out of sight too, or what were her mock going on. And to poor wet draggled women folk came up to town, some slowly crying as if their hearts was sick, and others just bent their heads to wind and went straight to their homes, nother looking nor speaking to anyone, but barred their doors and stiffened theirselves up for a night of waiting. Saturday morn, you'll mind Saturday morn it were stormy and gusty, downright dirty weather, there stood to folk again by daylight, a watchin' and a strainin', and by that tide to good fortune came more to bar. But Tegsi's men had sent back her news by to boat as took 'em there. They'd a deal of oil and a vast of blubber, but for all that her flag was droopin' into rain, half-mast high, for mourning and sorrow, and they'd a dead man aboard, a dead man as was living and strong last sunrise, and there was another as lay between life and death, and there was 7 more as should have been there as wasn't, but was carried off by to gang. To frigate, as we'n heard tell on, as lying off Hartlepool, got tidings fro to tender as captured to seamen on Thursday, and to Aurora, as they called her, made off for to Nord, and 9 leagues off St. Ab's Head, to Resolution think she were, she seed to frigate, and knowed by her build she were a man o' war, and guessed she were bound on King's kidnapping. I seen to wounded man mysen with my own eyes, and he'll live, niver a man died yet, with such a strong purpose of vengeance in him. He could barely speak, for he were badly shot, but his colour coom and went, as to master's mate and to captain telled me, and some others, how to Aurora fired at him, and how to innocent whaler hoisted her colours. But afore they were fairly run up, another shot coom close into shrouds, and then to Greenland ship being to windward, bore down on to frigate. But as they knew she were an old fox, and bent on mischief, Kinraid, that's he who lies a-dying, only he'll no un die as bound, the specksioneer, bade to men go down between decks, and fasten to hatches well, and he'd stand guard, he and captain and told master's mate, being left up on deck for to give a welcome just skin deep to boat's crew fra to Aurora, as they could see coming towards them or to water, with their regular man-o'-wars rowing. "Damn 'em," said Daniel in soliloquy and under his breath. Sylvia stood, poising her iron and listening eagerly, afraid to give Donkin the hot iron for fear of interrupting the narrative, unwilling to put it into the fire again because that action would perchance remind him of his work, which now the tailor had forgotten, so eager was he in telling his story. Well, they coom on over to waters with great bounds, and up to sides they coom like locusts, all armed men, and to captain says he saw Kinraid hide away his whaling knife under some tarpaulin, and he knew he meant mischief, and he would no more 'a stopped him wi' a word, nor he would 'a stopped him fra killing a whale. And when Aurora's men were aboard, one on 'em runs to helm, and at that to captain says he felt as if his wife were kissed afore his face. But says he, I bethought me on to men as were shut up below hatches, and I remembered to folk at Monkshaven as were looking out for us even then, and I said to myself I would speak fair as long as I could, more by token o' the whaling knife as I could see glinting bright under the black tarpaulin. So he spoke quite fair and civil, though he seed they was nearing Aurora, and Aurora was nearing them. Then t' navy captain hailed him through trumpet wi' a great rough blast, and says he, Order your men to come on deck. And t' captain of t' whalers says his men cried up from under t' hatches as they'd niver begin up without bloodshed, and he sees Kinraid take out his pistol and look well to priming. So he says to navy captain, We're protected Greenland men, and you have no right to meddle with us. But to navy captain only bellows to more, Order your men to come on deck. If they won't obey you, and you have lost the command of your vessel, I reckon you're in a state of mutiny, and you may come aboard to Aurora and such men as are willing to follow you, and I'll fire into the rest. You see, that were to the depth of the man. He were for pretending and pretexting as to captain couldna manage his own ship, and as he'd help him. But our Greenland captain were noan so poor-spirited, and says he, 'She's full of oil, and I ware you of the consequences if you fire into her. Anyhow, pirate or no pirate,' for to word pirate stuck in his gizzard, 'I'm a honest Monkshaven man, and I come fra a land where there's great icebergs and many a deadly danger, but niver a press gang, thank God, and that's what you are, I reckon.' Them's the words he told me, but whether he spoke 'em out so bold at the time, I's not so sure. They were in his mind for to speak, only maybe prudence got to better on him, for he said he prayed in his heart to bring his cargo safe to owners, come what might. Well, Aurora's men aboard to good fortune cried out, might they fire down to hatches and bring to men out that-a-way? And then to Specksioneer he speaks, and he says he stands o'er to hatches, and he has 2 good pistols, and summat besides, and he don't care for his life, being a bachelor, but all below are married men, you see, and he'll put an end to first 2 chaps as come near to hatches. And they say he picked 2 off as made for to come near, and then, just as he were stooping for to whaling knife, and it's as big as a sickle." "Teach folk as don't know a whaling knife," cried Daniel. "I were a Greenland man mysel." They shot him through to side and dizzied him and kicked him aside for dead, and fired down to hatches and killed 1 man and disabled 2, and then to rest cried for quarter, for life is sweet, e'en aboard a king's ship, and Aurora carried 'em off, wounded men and able men and all, leaving Kinraid for dead, as wasn't dead, and Darley for dead, as was dead, and to captain and master's mate as were too old for work, and to captain as loves Kinraid like a brother, poured rum down his throat and bandaged him up, and has sent for to first doctor in Monkshaven for to get the slugs out, for they say there's niver such a harpooner in a' to Greenland seas, and I can speak from my own seeing he's a fine young fellow where he lies there, all stark and wan for weakness and loss of blood. But Darley's dead as a doornail, and there's to be such a burying of him as niver was seen afore in Monkshaven come Sunday. And now give us to iron, wench, and let's lose no more time a-talking." "It's noan loss of time," said Daniel, moving himself heavily in his chair to feel how helpless he was once more. "If I were as young as I once were, nay, lad, if I had na these sore rheumatics now, I reckon as to press gang 'ud find out as to shouldn't do such things for nothing. Bless thee, man, it's war nor in my youth in the Ameriky war, and then 'twere bad enough." "And Kinraid," said Sylvia, drawing a long breath after the effort of realizing it all. Her cheeks had flushed up and her eyes had glittered during the progress of the tale. "Oh, he'll do. He'll not die. Life's stuff is in him yet." "He'll be Molly Corney's cousin, I reckon," said Sylvia, bethinking her with a blush of Molly Corney's implication that he was more than a cousin to her, and immediately longing to go off and see Molly, and hear all the little details which women do not think it beneath them to give to women. From that time Sylvia's little heart was bent on this purpose, but it was not one to be openly avowed even to herself. She only wanted sadly to see Molly, and she almost believed herself that it was to consult her about the fashion of her cloak, which Donkin was to cut out, and which she was to make under his directions. At any rate, this was the reason she gave to her mother when the day's work was done, and a fine gleam came out upon the pale and watery sky towards evening. End of chapter 5.